Chapter 1. A Wedding. "Edith," said Margaret gently. "Edith." But her cousin had fallen asleep. She lay curled up on the sofa in one of the sitting rooms of the house in Harley Street, looking very lovely in her white dress. The two girls had grown up together, but Edith was getting married in a few days, and it was only now, when she was going to lose her, that Margaret realized how beautiful and sweet her cousin was. They had been talking about Edith's future life on the Greek island of Corfu, where she would live with Captain Lennox after the wedding. But now she had fallen asleep, and Margaret, who had wanted to discuss her own future, had no one to talk to. Despite the lack of a listener, Margaret's thoughts were happy ones. For the last 10 years, her Aunt Shaw's house in London had been her home. But soon she was going to return to the country vicarage where her parents lived, and where she had spent her holidays. She was looking forward to the change, although she regretted the separation from her aunt and cousin. She was thinking dreamily of the vicarage when Mrs. Shaw called out from the room next door. She had invited some neighbours to dinner, and the ladies were talking in the sitting room, while their husbands remained in the dining room. "Edith! Edith!" Margaret rose and went next door. "Edith is asleep, Aunt Shaw. Can I help?" All the ladies said, "Poor child," on receiving this news, and the little dog in Mrs. Shaw's arms began to bark excitedly. "Be quiet, Tiny, you naughty little girl. I wanted to ask Edith to bring down her Indian shawls. Would you mind fetching them, Margaret?" Margaret went up to the room at the top of the house where the shawls were kept. 9 years ago, when she had first arrived in Harley Street, this room had been her bedroom. She remembered her first meal up there, away from her father and aunt who were eating below. Margaret had always had her meals with her father and mother. The 18-year-old girl remembered how she had cried that first night, hiding her face under the bedclothes. Now she had learnt to love her bedroom, and she looked round regretfully, knowing that she was leaving it forever. She carried the shawls downstairs, and as Edith was still asleep, her aunt asked her to put them on. The long, heavy shawls looked better on Margaret, who was tall and stately, than they would have looked on Edith, who was much shorter. Mrs. Shaw was adjusting a shawl around Margaret's shoulders when the door opened, and Captain Lennox's brother, Mr. Henry Lennox, came in. Margaret looked at Mr. Lennox with a laughing face, certain that he would be amused by her situation. Almost immediately Edith appeared, shaking her pretty curls. She had 100 questions to ask Henry, but he soon came and sat next to Margaret, as she had known he would. Margaret's face lit up with an honest, open smile. Henry Lennox liked and disliked almost the same things that she did, and now she was certain to have a pleasant evening. "Well, I suppose you are all very busy indeed, with ladies' business, I mean. Very different to my business, the law." "Indian shawls are very lovely." "And their prices are good too. But is this not your last dinner party before the wedding on Thursday? You have been very busy recently." "Yes," replied Margaret. "I wonder if it is possible to have a quiet time before a wedding." "What would your wedding be like?" "Oh, I have never thought much about it. I would like it to be a fine summer morning and to walk to church through shady trees. It is natural for me to think of Helston Church rather than a London one." "Tell me about Helston. Is it a village or a town?" Oh, I don't think you could call it a village. There is a church, with a few houses near it. Cottages, really, with roses growing all over them. It sounds like a village in a children's story. It is, replied Margaret eagerly. It's like a village in a poem. It sounds lovely. What is the vicarage like? Oh, please don't ask me to describe my home. It's much too difficult. Margaret, don't be cross with me. I'm not cross with you, said Margaret, looking directly at him with her large, soft eyes. Then tell me what you do there. How do you fill your day? I walk a lot. We have no horse, not even for father. Do you go to dances? Oh no, nothing like that. We don't have the money. I can see you won't tell me anything. Before the holiday ends, I think I will visit you and see what you really do there. I hope you will. Then you will see how beautiful Helston is. Tall, handsome Captain Lennox, who had just arrived, came over to greet his brother, with Edith smiling proudly by his side. The two men shook hands, and Mrs. Shaw welcomed the captain in her gentle way. Her husband had died many years ago, but she lived a very comfortable life. Lately she had been worrying about her health, and she started a conversation with the captain about the possibility of spending the winter in Italy, where it was warmer. Mr. Henry Lennox leaned against the wall, amused by the family scene. Unlike his brother, he was not handsome, but he had a clever, interesting face, and people liked him. He was enjoying watching the two cousins as they arranged the table for tea. Edith was doing her best to show the captain what a good wife she would be, but he noticed that Margaret was much more efficient. Chapter 2. Helston. It was the second half of July when Margaret returned home. The trees were a dark, shadowy green. The plants below caught the sunlight as it came through the leaves, and the weather was hot and still. Margaret took long walks with her father, taking pleasure in the sweet forest smells and the wild, free-living creatures that she saw there. This life, at least these walks, were just as Margaret had hoped. She loved her forest and had good friends there. She nursed their babies, read to the old people, and brought food to the sick. Her outdoor life was perfect. Her indoor life had its disadvantages. On arriving home, she had immediately realized that all was not as it should be. Her mother, always so kind and loving towards her, from time to time seemed deeply discontented. Mrs. Hale said that the forest, so near to the house, affected her health. But her biggest complaints were the family's lack of money and her husband's low position in the Church of England. When she mentioned the subject, Mr. Hale would reply sadly that as long as he could do his duty in Little Helston, he was thankful. But there were lines of anxiety on his face that had not been there before, and each day he seemed more lost and confused. Margaret was unprepared for these long hours of discontent. She had known that she would have to give up many luxuries when she returned to Helston, and she had quite enjoyed the idea. There had been a few complaints from her mother when Margaret had spent her holidays at home before, but because the memory of those times was generally happy, she had forgotten the small, less pleasant details. Autumn rains came in the second half of September, and Margaret often had to stay in the house. Helston was at some distance from any neighbours of a similar social position. "It is undoubtedly one of the most isolated places in England," said Mrs. Hale sadly. "If only we were within walking distance of the Stansfields and the Gormans." "The Gormans?" said Margaret. "Are those the Gormans who made their fortune in trade in Southampton? I'm glad we don't visit them. I don't like people in trade. I think it's much better for us to know poor country people, people who do not claim to be better than they are." "You must not be so hard to please, Margaret dear," said Mrs. Hale, secretly thinking of a young and handsome Mr. Gorman whom she had once met. "That's not true. I like all those who work on the land. I'm sure you don't want me to admire butchers and bakers, people like that, do you?" "But the Gormans were neither butchers nor bakers, but very respectable carriage builders." "Nevertheless, carriage building is a trade, and rather a useless one in my opinion. I would much prefer to walk than travel in a carriage." And Margaret did walk, in spite of the weather. She was so happy outdoors, at her father's side, that she almost danced. But the evenings were rather difficult to fill pleasantly. Immediately after tea, her father disappeared into his small library, and she and her mother were left alone. Her mother had never enjoyed books much, and when Mrs. Hale began to compare her sister's comfortable life in London with her own life at the vicarage, Margaret would stop talking and listen to the rain as it fell on the sitting-room window. Once or twice she wondered if she could ask about a subject of great importance to her, her older brother Frederick. He had joined the Navy some years ago and had taken part in a mutiny, with the result that he was now unable to return to England, as he would be arrested if he did. Margaret very much wanted to ask where Frederick was now, and what he was doing. But an awareness that her mother's bad health dated from the time of the mutiny made her unwilling to do so. Similarly, her father's anxious face made her pause and turn away from the subject each time she approached it. Frederick's room was kept exactly as he had left it, and was regularly cleaned by Dixon, Mrs. Hale's servant. Dixon lovingly remembered the day when she had first been employed to look after pretty Miss Beresford, as Mrs. Hale had been called then. Dixon had never thought that Mr. Hale was good enough for her dear lady, and considered that he had caused her much heartache. She saw herself as Mrs. Hale's only protector. Frederick had always been her favourite, and her rather stiff manner softened a little when she went in each week to tidy his room. Margaret felt sure that there had been some news of Frederick, unknown to her mother, which was making her kind and gentle father anxious. Often, in conversation, his mind seemed elsewhere, and he spent more time than usual in his study. But when fine weather came in the second half of October, her worries disappeared, and she thought of nothing except the beauty of the forest. She was preparing to take her artist's notebook and go drawing in the forest when Dixon threw the sitting-room door open and announced, "Mr. Henry Lennox." The sun shone through the window onto Margaret's face as she walked forwards to shake hands with him. "I am so glad you have come," she said. "Did I not say that I would?" he asked. "I have a little note from Edith. Ah, here it is." "Oh, thank you," exclaimed Margaret, and went to tell her mother that Mr. Lennox had arrived. When she had gone, Mr. Lennox began to look around in his sharp-eyed way. The little sitting-room was looking its best in the morning sunlight. The window was open, and roses crept around the corner, while the garden was bright with flowers of every colour. But the brightness outside made the colours inside seem faded. The carpet was old, and the house was smaller than he had expected, as Margaret herself seemed so queenly. It's as she said. They have very little money, he thought. Margaret returned with her mother, who greeted Mr. Lennox with great friendliness, and it was agreed that the couple should go to draw in the forest and then return for lunch. Margaret led Mr. Lennox through the forest to 2 little cottages. There they took out their notebooks and began to draw the pretty scene. When the time came to show each other what they had done, Margaret discovered that Mr. Lennox had drawn her. "I hardly dare tell you how much I like this picture," he said. Margaret turned away to pack up her notebook and pencils, and Mr. Lennox was not quite sure whether she had heard his words. They returned to the vicarage, and the conversation at lunch flowed quietly and pleasantly. After the meal, he suggested that they should walk in the garden. "What a perfect life you seem to live here," he said, looking up at the tall forest trees that enclosed the garden like a nest. "Please remember that our skies are not always blue. We have rain and even storms sometimes, although I do think that Helston is about as perfect as any place in the world." "I almost wish, Margaret," said Mr. Lennox, and then hesitated. It was so unusual for the clever lawyer to hesitate that Margaret looked up at him questioningly. "Margaret," Mr. Lennox continued, taking her hand, "I wish you didn't like Helston so much, and that you missed your friends in London more, enough to make you listen more kindly to someone who is not wealthy, it is true, but who does love you, Margaret." Margaret made a strong effort to be calm, and then said, "I did not know that you cared for me in that way. I have always thought of you as a friend." "But may I hope that at some time you will think of me as a lover?" Margaret was silent for a minute or two, trying to discover the truth in her own heart before she replied. Then she said, "I have only ever thought of you as a friend. I am sure I could never think of you as anything else. Let us both forget that this conversation has taken place." Mr. Lennox paused before he replied. Then, in a colder voice, he said, "Of course, as this conversation is rather unpleasant to you, I will try to forget it." "You are upset," Margaret said sadly. "But how can I help it?" She looked so sad as she said this that he struggled for a moment with his real disappointment, and then said more cheerfully, but still with a little hardness in his voice, "I am not known to be a romantic man, and the only time that I allow myself to be so, I am rejected. It was madness to think that I, a poor lawyer, could hope to marry." The whole tone of these words annoyed Margaret, and reminded her of why she could not accept him, and it was fortunate that Mr. Hale appeared just then, and a lighter conversation began. Margaret said little, wondering when Mr. Lennox would go. He, too, was anxious to leave, but to save his self-respect began talking in a bored kind of way about his life in London. Mr. Hale was puzzled. This was not the man he had met in the city and at lunch that day. It was a relief to all of them when Mr. Lennox said that he needed to leave immediately in order to catch the 5 o'clock train. At the last moment, Henry Lennox's real self broke through. "Margaret, don't dislike me. I have a heart, though I pretend that I do not. I believe I love you more than ever, if I do not hate you, for the disdain on your face as you have listened to me during this last half-hour. Goodbye, Margaret. Margaret." He was gone. The house was locked up for the evening. Margaret sat alone by the fire in the sitting room, with unlit candles on the table behind her, thinking about the day. The happy walk, the drawing in the forest, the cheerful lunch, and the uncomfortable, miserable walk in the garden. She felt very unhappy that she had had to refuse him, but what else could she have done when moments after her refusal he had spoken as if success in life was the only thing that mattered to him? Oh dear, she could have loved him so much if only he had been different. Then she thought that, after all, perhaps he had talked in that cold, hard way to hide his disappointment. She was still considering this when Mr. Hale entered, sighing deeply. "Margaret," he said at last, in a sudden, desperate way, "can you come into my study? I want to speak to you about something very serious." In the study, Mr. Hale made Margaret take a chair next to him. He stirred the fire and then said shakily, "Margaret, I am going to leave Helston." "Leave Helston, father? But why?" "Because I can no longer be a clergyman in the Church of England." Margaret's immediate response was a feeling of shock and disbelief. "Why? Why can you no longer be a clergyman? Is it because of Frederick?" "It is not about Frederick. It is all me. For a long time now I have had serious doubts about the authority of the Church. These doubts have torn me in two, and are so great that I feel I have no choice. I must leave." "But, father, have you truly considered the consequences?" asked Margaret, bursting into tears. Mr. Hale rose and walked up and down the room, talking to himself in a low voice. Finally he said, "Margaret, I have thought about it for a long time. I must do what my heart and mind tell me. I have arranged things so that we will be leaving Helston in a fortnight." Margaret sat as still as stone. "In a fortnight? Where will we go?" "To Milton Northern," her father answered lifelessly. "Milton Northern? The manufacturing town in Berkshire?" "Yes," he answered in the same depressed way. "You remember Mr. Bell, an old friend of mine at Oxford University? He teaches at the university now. I wrote to him about my troubles. His hometown is Milton Northern, and he owns property there, which has greatly increased in value since Milton has become such a large manufacturing town. He feels certain that I can earn a living there as a private tutor." "A private tutor?" cried Margaret scornfully. "Are manufacturers interested in studying ancient Greek literature?" "Oh," said Mr. Hale, "some of them really seem to be fine fellows. Mr. Bell has recommended me to a Mr. Thornton, a tenant of his, and a very intelligent man apparently." "And mother knows nothing about this?" asked Margaret fearfully. "Nothing. Poor, poor Maria. Margaret, I dare not tell her." "No," said Margaret sadly. "I will do it." "Oh, father," she cried, "tell me it is all a terrible dream. You do not really mean it." Mr. Hale sat perfectly still as she spoke. Then he looked her in the face and said slowly, "You must not deceive yourself, Margaret. I do mean it." He looked at her for some moments, and she gazed back. Then she rose, and without a look or a word, left the room. That night, Margaret sat by her bedroom window, looking out at the brightly lit church, too full of sorrow to cry, but with a cold pain in her heart that made her feel old and hopeless. The afternoon spent with Mr. Lennox seemed like a dream. The hard reality was that because her father had doubts about the authority of the church, their whole life was going to change. Margaret felt as she never had before, completely alone. That night she dreamt that Henry Lennox fell from a high tree and was killed. In the morning she woke feeling exhausted, and the awful reality came back to her. At breakfast, the fine autumn morning made Mrs. Hale feel particularly well, and she talked happily, planning visits to the villagers. Mr. Hale left, saying he would be out for the whole day. Unlike her father, who would have postponed telling the bad news as long as possible, Margaret took a deep breath and asked her mother to walk with her in the garden. There, Margaret told her about Mr. Hale's decisions and his plan to leave Helston. At first, her mother did not believe her. "He would surely have told me before this," she cried. But when Margaret insisted that they were going to leave Helston in a fortnight, her mother started to cry quietly, unable to bear the thought of living in a manufacturing town. "But think of the shame," she whispered. "Your father is going to leave the church. No one we know will want to know us." For the rest of that day, Margaret never left her mother. When evening came and Mr. Hale returned, his face grey and fearful, his wife threw herself on him and burst into tears, crying, "Oh, Richard, Richard, you should have told us sooner." On hearing this, Margaret left the room and ran up to her bedroom, where she cried bitterly for many hours. But heartbroken as she was, it immediately became clear that her parents were depending on her to make the necessary arrangements for the move to Milton Northern. Mr. Hale was so depressed that he was unable to make any decisions, while Mrs. Hale now became really ill and had to spend most of each day in bed. A fortnight was a very short time, and Margaret felt that a great weight had suddenly been thrown upon her shoulders. However, with Dixon's help, she began to plan the move. Chapter 3. The Move to Milton Northern. The Hale family left Helston early one morning to take a train to London. The vicarage, half covered with roses, looked lovelier than ever in the morning sun, and they found it hard to believe they would never see it again. Margaret, who was looking very pale, appeared calm, but her heart was aching. She leant back in her seat and shut her eyes, and the tears rolled slowly down her cheeks. They spent a night in London at a quiet hotel, and the next day took the train to Heston, a small seaside town about 20 miles from Milton Northern. Margaret's plan was that her mother and Dixon could stay there, while she and her father went to Milton Northern to look for a house. They found clean, cheerful rooms in Heston, and she felt able to rest at last. But the future must be met, however difficult it may be. One morning, Margaret and her father set off for Milton Northern. As they approached the town, they saw that a dark grey cloud hung over it, and the air started to taste and smell slightly of smoke. Soon they were travelling through long, straight streets of small brick houses. Huge factories sent out clouds of black smoke, and the streets were crowded with people. They found their hotel, which was near the centre of the town, and left immediately to begin their search. There was not much money to spend on rent, and it was difficult to find a house that was big enough for their needs. After some hours, Margaret said, "I think we should go back to the second house, the one in Crampton. That was the name of the suburb, I think. But the colours and the wallpaper. Surely you can ask the landlord to repaper one or two of the rooms, and the bookshelves will hide some of the walls. Then you think we should take it? If you do, I will take you back to the hotel, and you can have lunch and rest while I visit the landlord. I only hope he will agree to repaper the rooms. As Margaret entered the hotel, a waiter came to tell her that Mr. Thornton was waiting in their rooms to see them. Margaret went in to meet him in her usual fearless way. She was used to London society and was not at all shy. Mr. Thornton was much more surprised and uncomfortable than she was. Instead of a quiet, middle-aged clergyman, here was a young woman who was very different to those he usually met. She wore a simple dark silk dress and a large Indian shawl that made her look like an Eastern queen. Her gaze was direct and completely uninterested. "Mr. Thornton, I believe," said Margaret. "Will you sit down?" "My father will return soon. He has gone to see Mr. Donkins, the landlord of a house in Crampton that my father wishes to take." Mr. Thornton had promised Mr. Bell that he would do his best to help Mr. Hale, and he had been to look at the house in Crampton. He had thought that it was perfect, but now that he had met Margaret, he was not so sure. Margaret's short upper lip, strong chin, and the way she moved her head and body always made strangers think that she was haughty. She sat directly opposite Mr. Thornton, and he had to admit that she was very beautiful, with her white neck and graceful curves. But her obvious lack of interest made him feel like a rough, uncivilized fellow, and he was not sure he liked her. He thought that her quiet, calm manner was rather disdainful, and he was telling himself that he would leave when Mr. Hale entered and apologized in his pleasant way for not being there to meet him. The two men began to talk about their friend, Mr. Bell, and Margaret moved to the window and watched the street. "Margaret," said Mr. Hale suddenly, "the landlord refused to change the wallpaper." "Oh dear," she said, and began to think of ways of hiding it. Her father invited Mr. Thornton to have lunch with them, but since Margaret did not add her own invitation, Mr. Thornton felt unable to accept. He left, feeling more uncomfortable than ever in his life before. When they returned to Heston, Mrs. Hale was full of questions about how they had spent the day. "And what is Mr. Thornton like?" she asked. "Oh, I don't know," said Margaret, who was feeling tired. "He is a tall, broad-shouldered man of about 30, I think, with a face that is not ugly, but not handsome either. He is not quite a gentleman, but one would not expect that." "He is not a coarse man," said her father. "Oh, no," said Margaret. "His expression is much too powerful and determined. He looks like what he is, a great tradesman." "Don't call the Milton cotton manufacturers tradesmen, Margaret," said her father. "They are very different." "Are they? I use the word for those who have something to sell." "Oh, Mother, you must prepare yourself for the sitting-room wallpaper. Pink and blue roses with yellow leaves." But when they moved to the house in Milton, the landlord had changed the wallpaper. They did not know that when Mr. Thornton, the wealthy manufacturer, asked for something to be done, people hurried to obey. It was difficult for the family to feel comfortable in their new home. The thick yellow November fogs crept up to the windows and through every open door. Mrs. Hale was miserable and caught a bad cold. Mr. Hale was equally miserable and came to Margaret for sympathy, but she was unable to comfort him. The move to Milton had spent nearly all their money. Here they were, and here they must remain. At night, when Margaret realised this, she felt quite despairing. The heavy, smoky air hung in her bedroom, and all she could see from her window was a blank wall. A letter from Edith arrived, describing her new life in her pretty house overlooking the sea. It was a life without any problems. Margaret wondered if her old friends thought about her at all. What would her life have been like if she had agreed to marry Henry Lennox? But she knew he would have found it very difficult to accept her father's changed position in society. Mr. Hale found several pupils, recommended by either Mr. Bell or Mr. Thornton. They were mostly schoolboys, and Mr. Thornton was probably the oldest of Mr. Hale's students. He was certainly the favourite. Mr. Hale quoted his opinions so often that it became a family joke to wonder how much time the men spent studying when so much time was spent in conversation. One of Margaret's tasks was to find a servant to help Dixon in the kitchen. The rough girls who had replied to their advertisements were not at all suitable, so Margaret went up and down the Milton streets, visiting shops, looking for a girl who Dixon would accept. But all the girls she saw preferred to work at a mill, where the wages were better. In London, when Margaret went out walking, she had always been accompanied by a servant. But here she walked alone, among the crowds who poured in and out of the factories. They came rushing along, with loud voices and fearless faces, and at first they frightened her. The girls commented on her clothes, and sometimes even touched them, but they were not unfriendly. The undisguised admiration of the men upset her, however, as she had never received this kind of attention before. She was returning home one day when a middle-aged worker said as he passed her, "A face as pretty as yours should always be smiling." The man looked so weighed down with worries that she smiled at him, and he smiled back. Whenever they passed each other again, they did not speak, but a silent recognition grew between them. Once or twice she saw him walking with an unhealthy-looking girl, apparently his daughter. One morning in May, she had been to pick flowers in the countryside and was walking back home when she met the couple. She offered the flowers to the girl, and the girl's pale blue eyes lit up as she took them. "Thank you, miss, that's kind of you," said the man. "You're not from round here, I don't think." "No," said Margaret, half sighing. "I come from the south." The girl was walking very slowly, and Margaret turned to her and said sweetly, "I am afraid you are not very strong." "No," said the girl, "and I never will be." "Spring is here," said Margaret. "It won't do me any good." "She's right, poor girl," said the man. Margaret felt shocked, but also interested. "Where do you live?" she asked. 9 Francis Street. "And your name? I must not forget that." "Nicholas Higgins. And she's called Bessie Higgins." "I would like to come and see you," said Margaret shyly. "I don't like strangers in my house," said the man. But seeing Margaret's expression, added, "You may come if you like." As the couple turned to go their own way, the girl said, "You won't forget to come and see us." "She'll come. I can see it in her face," said the father impatiently. "Come on, Bess, the mill bell is ringing." Margaret went home, thinking about her new friends, glad that she had found a human interest. From that day, Milton seemed a brighter place to her. Chapter 4. New Friends. The day after Margaret's meeting with Higgins and his daughter, Mr. Hale nervously informed his wife and daughter that he had invited Mr. Thornton to tea that night. "Mr. Thornton? And tonight? What does the man want to come here for?" Mrs. Hale said, with the expression of pain on her face that had recently become habitual. But since the invitation had been given, preparations had to be made, and Margaret spent the day ironing in the kitchen, while Dixon made cakes. When Mrs. Hale saw her daughter's tired face, she was upset. "If anyone had told me when I was Miss Beresford that a child of mine would have to work in the kitchen like a servant, preparing to entertain a tradesman—" "Oh, Mother," said Margaret, "I don't mind what kind of work I do if it's for you and Father. And poor Mr. Thornton can't help being a tradesman. With his education, I don't suppose he could do anything else." In Mr. Thornton's house, a similar yet different scene was taking place. A large-boned woman in her late 60s, with strong features and a severe expression, sat sewing in an expensively decorated dining room. She was busy mending a long tablecloth when her son entered the room. "John, I thought you were going to tea with that friend of Mr. Bell's." "I am, Mother. I've come home to change my clothes." "Change your clothes? Why should you put on your best clothes to have a cup of tea with an old clergyman?" "Mr. Hale is a gentleman, and his wife and daughter are ladies." "You have never mentioned his family before." "I have only met the daughter, and that was for half an hour." "Don't let her try to catch you, John. You're a rich man." Mr. Thornton frowned. "Mother, when I met her she treated me as if she was a queen and I was her servant. You need not worry." He left the room. "As if she was a queen and he was her servant?" Mrs. Thornton thought aloud. "Where could a woman find another man like John? He has the best heart I ever knew. I hate her." Mr. Thornton arrived at the Hales' house at exactly 7:30. Mr. Hale greeted him kindly and introduced him to his wife, whose pale face and tired manner suggested that she was not well. It was getting dark, and Margaret was lighting the lamp as he entered. Looking around the sitting room, the mill owner was impressed by its prettiness and style. Somehow, it was much more comfortable and attractive than any of the rooms in his own large house. Margaret was serving the tea, and her movements were so graceful that at first he could not take his eyes off her. But soon he and Mr. Hale began discussing a subject that interested them both: the relationship between the mill owners and the workers. Now it was Margaret's turn to watch Mr. Thornton and notice how different he was to her father. While Mr. Hale's expression was soft and dreamy, Mr. Thornton's eyes seemed to want to enter the heart of everything he looked at. He rarely smiled, but when he did, it had the effect of sudden sunlight. Margaret liked Mr. Thornton's smile. It was the first thing she had admired in her father's new friend. "I won't deny that I am proud of belonging to a manufacturing town," said Mr. Thornton to Mr. Hale. "I would rather be a working man here than a rich man in the South, living a dull, lazy life." Hearing this, Margaret felt so angry that her face reddened. "You do not know anything about the South. There is less trade there, but there is also less suffering. I see men in the streets here who work so hard they look ill. And may I say you do not know the North, said Mr. Thornton gently, seeing that he had really hurt Margaret. But she did not answer, and so he continued the conversation with Mr. Hale. At the beginning of this century, the mill owners had almost unlimited power. We have much less power now. Now there are more factories, and more men are needed, so the relationship between the mill owners and the workers is more evenly balanced. One cannot say who will win the battle. Must you call it a battle between the two classes? Asked Mr. Hale. But it is a battle. Those who are successful work harder and behave more wisely than those who are not. And it is an unfortunate truth that lazy and foolish people will always oppose those who are successful. If I understand you correctly, you consider all those who are not successful in the world, for whatever reason, as your enemies then, said Margaret in a clear, cold voice. As their own enemies, certainly, said Mr. Thornton quickly, hurt by the disapproval in her voice. But he felt that he should explain his meaning more clearly. He knew he could best illustrate what he wanted to say by telling them something about his own life. Feeling a little shy, so that his face went slightly red, he continued. I say this because of my own experiences. 16 years ago, my father died in very miserable circumstances. I was taken from school and had to become a man in only a few days. Fortunately, I had a very strong and determined mother. We went to live in a small country town. There I found work in a clothes shop, and the money I earned, which was very little, had to support my mother, my sister, and myself. My mother taught me to save a little money each week, and in this way I learnt self-control. Now that I can afford to look after her in the way she deserves, I thank her silently for teaching me this valuable lesson. I believe that unsuccessful people have not bothered to learn it, and so I feel contempt for them. Margaret did not reply to this speech, and soon Mr. Thornton got up to leave. He shook hands with Mr. and Mrs. Hale, then went towards Margaret to shake hands with her too, as was the custom in Milton. But it was not the custom in the South, and Margaret just bowed, although as soon as she saw the hand half extended, then quickly withdrawn, she was sorry she had not been aware of his intention. Mr. Thornton, however, did not realize this, and walked off angrily, telling himself that she was the proudest, most unpleasant girl he had ever met. Margaret, said Mr. Hale, after Mr. Thornton had left, I could not help watching your face when Mr. Thornton confessed that he had been a shop boy. I was aware of it, because Mr. Bell had told me, but I half expected you to get up and leave the room. Oh, Father, do you really think I am so silly? I liked the story of his childhood more than anything else he said. Everything else disgusted me. He was so hard. He didn't seem to realize that other people may not have received the training his mother gave him, or that it was his duty to help the less fortunate. But I did like the way he spoke about himself so simply, and with such love and respect for his mother. I heard a lot about his early life from Mr. Bell before we came here, said Mr. Hale. And as he has told you part of it, I will tell you the rest. His father lost all his money and then killed himself. After his death, no one offered to help the family. Mr. Bell said they had very little to eat for years. But when the young man had made enough money, he visited all the people whom his father owed money to and began to pay them back. It was done very quietly, but finally he paid all his father's debts. It helped him that Mr. Bell, one of the people his father owed money to, invited him to work with him. "That was a very fine thing for Mr. Thornton to do," said Margaret. "It is such a pity, then, that wealth is the only thing that matters to him." She was getting up to leave the room as she said this, and just as she was opening the door, she said, "Father, I do think that Mr. Thornton is a very unusual man, but I don't like him at all." "And I do," said her father, laughing, "although I don't see him as a hero or anything like that. But good night, child. Your mother looks very tired tonight." Margaret had noticed her mother's unhealthy appearance in recent weeks, and it had made her anxious. Realizing from her father's remark that he had noticed it too, she felt even more fearful. There were good reasons to worry about her mother's health. Their life in Milton was so different from the way they had lived in Helston, where they had spent much of their time outside in the fresh country air. In Milton, the air was heavy with factory smoke, and Mrs. Hale did not like going out much. And then there were the financial worries and the difficulty in finding a servant. There were other signs that something was wrong. Margaret sometimes heard her mother and Dixon talking in low voices in the bedroom. Dixon would come out crying, which was the way she behaved when Mrs. Hale was very upset about something. Margaret suspected that her mother had some secret about her health that she was not telling her. That night she lay awake for hours, planning ways in which she could help. If she could find a servant to help Dixon with her duties, then Dixon could give her mother the attention she had been accustomed to all her life. Margaret spent the next few days looking for a servant, but without success. One afternoon she met Bessie Higgins in the street and stopped to talk to her. "Bessie, how are you? Better, I hope, now that it's warmer." "Better and not better, if you see what I mean." "Not exactly," said Margaret, smiling. "I'm not coughing, so I'm better in that way, but I'm tired of Milton, and I want to go to a better place." For a minute or two, Margaret did not speak. Then she said in a low voice, "Bessie, do you really wish to die?" Bessie replied, "If you'd lived the life I've lived and been as sick as I have, then you'd be glad enough when the doctor said he feared you'd never see another winter." "Why, Bessie? What kind of a life have you had?" "If you'd come to my house when you said you would, I could maybe have told you." "I have been very busy," said Margaret quietly. "But may I go home with you now?" Seeing from Margaret's soft, friendly expression that she was sincere, Bessie said, "You may come if you want." They walked together in silence until they reached a narrow, dirty street. When they entered the house, Margaret saw that a girl younger than Bessie, but taller, was washing clothes in a rough, capable way, making a lot of noise as she did so. Bessie sat down, breathless and exhausted, and closed her eyes. Margaret asked the sister, who was called Mary, to fetch a glass of water, and Bessie drank it and felt better. She asked Margaret where she had lived before Milton, and Margaret described Helston to her, doing her best to describe its beauty. "I used to think once that if I could have a day of doing nothing, a day in some quiet place like the one you described, I would feel better," Bessie said. "But now I've had so many days of doing nothing, and I'm just as tired as when I was at work. I was well until Mother died, but soon after that I got sick." It was when I began to work in a part of the factory where the air was filled with white dust from the cotton. They say the dust gets into your lungs and you start coughing blood. But can't they do something about it? Asked Margaret, shocked. There's a great wheel they can use to blow away the dust, but it costs a lot of money. They didn't have one at our factory. How old are you? Asked Margaret. 19 in July. And I too am 19. Thinking of the contrast between them, Margaret could not speak for a moment. Then, seeing that Bessie was becoming even more tired, she said, I must go. I will come again as soon as I can. But if I don't come for a week or two, don't think I've forgotten you. I may be busy. I know you'll come again. But remember, in a week or two, I may be dead and buried. I'll come as soon as I can, said Margaret, holding Bessie's hand in hers for a moment. From that day, Mrs. Hale seemed to become more and more unwell. It was about 10 months now since Edith's marriage, and looking back, Margaret saw so many difficulties. But there had been moments of real pleasure, and it was a comfort to her that she and her mother were becoming closer at last. One evening, when Mr. Hale was away, Mrs. Hale began to talk about Frederick. She explained that he had taken the name of Dickinson so that he would not be recognised. She told Margaret to go to her desk and open a drawer, where she would find his letters. Margaret carried the yellow, sea-stained letters to her mother, who untied the string that held them together with trembling fingers. She gave them to Margaret to read, and at the same time told her the story of the mutiny, as she had learnt it from Frederick. Captain Reed, the captain of the Russell, Frederick's ship, had been a cruel man, who treated his men so badly that one of them had died. The men had mutinied and put Captain Reed off the Russell, sending him out in a boat with some of his officers. The boat had been found some days later by a West Indian ship. Frederick, who was one of the most senior officers, had been among those who had mutinied. Reporting the incident, the English newspapers had named him as one of those responsible for the mutiny, and said that he ought to be hung by the neck. He fought in justice, and I am proud of him, said Mrs. Hale in a weak voice. But I wish I could see him once more. It is 7 years ago. Would they still hang him, Mother? Some of the sailors who mutinied were captured and tried in court. They were hanged. And the worst thing was that the court said that their superior officers had encouraged them to mutiny. The two women were silent for a long time. And Frederick was in South America for several years. Yes, and now he is in Spain, somewhere near Cadiz. If he comes to England, he will be hanged. I shall never see his face again. Mrs. Hale turned her face to the wall and lay very still. Nothing could be said to comfort her. When her father came in, Margaret left the room, seeing no promise of brightness anywhere. End of CD 1. Chapter 5. A Strike Begins. 4 or 5 days after his visit to the Hales, Mr. Thornton decided that his mother and sister should also visit them. But he had some difficulty persuading them to do so. Mrs. Thornton did not often go out visiting, and she did not understand why she should become friends with a teacher. Eventually she agreed, but it was then Fanny's turn to protest. "I am not coming," she said. "I have a headache today." Fanny, I wish you to go, said her brother, authoritatively. Please go without me saying any more about it. Mrs. Thornton sighed. Unlike her mother and her brother, Fanny was not a strong character, and Mrs. Thornton had an unconscious contempt for those who were weak. She behaved lovingly towards her daughter, and a stranger might have thought that she loved her more than her son. The opposite was true. The honesty with which mother and son spoke to each other showed the great respect they had for each other's strength. Mrs. Thornton thanked God for her son every day of her life. That afternoon, Mrs. Thornton and Fanny set out in their carriage for Crampton. When she entered the Hales' little sitting-room, Mrs. Thornton, who was shy and hated meeting strangers, hid her shyness by looking even more severe than usual. She and Mrs. Hale started a conversation about servants, while Margaret, who was sewing, tried hard to talk to Fanny. "I see no piano, so I suppose you are not musical," said Fanny. "I am fond of good music, but I cannot play well myself. We sold our old piano when we came here." "How can you exist without one? A piano is a necessity." "You have good concerts here, I believe," said Margaret coldly. "Oh, yes, one is sure to hear the newest music here." "Do you like new music, then?" "Oh, one knows it is the fashion in London. You have been to London, of course." "Yes," said Margaret. "I lived there for several years. Have you never been there? It is an easy journey by train." "I would love to go, but Mother does not wish to. She is very proud of Milton, you see. To me it is a dirty, smoky place, but I believe she admires it for those qualities." "If it has been Mrs. Thornton's home for some years, I can understand her loving it," said Margaret in her clear voice. "May I ask what you